The beautiful blonde flight attendant at the Olympic team check-in counter looked down at the tall, lean young man standing before her with his worn gym bag and faded jacket, and her smile immediately disappeared. "I'm sorry, but Olympic athletes check in at the priority desk," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe for a second that this kid belonged anywhere near the Olympic team. What she didn't know was she was looking at Cassius Clay. And in exactly 9 days, this underestimated teenager would shock the entire world and become Olympic gold medalist. But they had no idea they were facing a future champion. And what happened next in Rome would change boxing history forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of the young fighter everyone underestimated, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you believe in recognizing greatness regardless of appearance, and if you believe we should never judge a champion by their clothes or their age, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove you should never underestimate the power of quiet confidence and determination. Now, let us get into what really happened when 18-year-old Cassius Clay walked into the Rome Olympics in 1960 and changed everything. It was a humid August morning in 1960 when Cassius Clay stepped off the plane in Rome, Italy, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear he'd never felt before. The summer heat wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, and the unfamiliar sounds of Italian conversations filled the air at Fiumino Airport. Clay was just 18 years old, a kid from Louisville, Kentucky, who had never been outside the United States before. And now here he was about to represent his country at the Olympic Games. He wore a simple jacket that was too big for his lean frame hand-me-down pants that had seen better days and carried a gym bag that his trainer had given him because Clay's family couldn't afford new luggage. The other American boxers on the flight were older, more experienced, and they carried themselves with the confident swagger of athletes who had been on international stages before. They had matching team jackets, expensive equipment bags, and they moved through the airport like they owned it. Clay watched them with a mixture of admiration and determination, knowing that in their eyes he was just the skinny kid who had barely made the team. The light heavyweight nobody expected to medal, let alone win gold. At the Olympic Village registration desk stood Coach Walter Bennett, a stern-faced man in his 50s who'd been training Olympic boxers for 2 decades. He'd seen hundreds of young fighters come and go, and he had very specific ideas about what made a champion. When Clay approached the desk with his tattered gym bag, Bennett barely looked up from his clipboard. The coach had already decided that Clay was too young, too inexperienced, too unorthodox in his style to make any real impact in Rome. The kid talked too much, moved too much, didn't follow traditional boxing fundamentals. Bennett had tried to keep Clay off the Olympic team entirely, arguing that they should send more seasoned fighters. "Name?" Bennett asked, his tone suggesting this was a waste of his time. "Cassius Marcellus Clay, sir," the young fighter replied, his voice carrying that distinctive Louisville accent mixed with nervous energy that would one day become famous around the world. Bennett finally looked up, his expression unchanged. "Clay, right? You're in the light heavyweight division. Your first preliminary bout is in 3 days against a Belgian fighter. I suggest you use that time to get familiar with international boxing rules, because what worked in Golden Gloves tournaments back home won't work here." What Bennett didn't know, what none of the coaches or officials, or even Clay's own teammates knew, was that this skinny kid from Louisville had something inside him that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Clay had been boxing since he was 12 years old, training in a basement gym in Louisville after his bicycle was stolen. And a police officer named Joe Martin suggested he learn to fight before seeking revenge. For 6 years, Clay had been perfecting a style that defied every traditional boxing convention, developing hand speed that seemed impossible for someone his size, and cultivating a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but was built on thousands of hours of relentless training. The Olympic Village in Rome was unlike anything Clay had ever experienced. Athletes from every corner of the globe lived side by side, training together, eating together, sharing stories in a dozen different languages. Clay loved it. While other American fighters stayed close to their own team, Clay wandered through the village like a tourist, introducing himself to wrestlers from Turkey, swimmers from Australia, track athletes from Kenya. His enthusiasm was infectious, his smile genuine. But when he talked about winning gold in boxing, most athletes just smiled politely and changed the subject. Everyone could see he was young, inexperienced, outmatched by the European champions who had been fighting internationally for years. In the days leading up to his first fight, Clay watched the other boxers in his division train. They were impressive, powerful men who moved with mechanical precision. But Clay noticed something that none of the coaches seemed to see. These fighters were predictable. They followed textbook combinations, traditional defensive stances, conventional strategies that Clay had studied and learned to counter. While they were stronger and more experienced, Clay was faster, more creative, more willing to take risks that traditional boxers would never attempt. His roommate in the Olympic Village was a shot putter named Harold Johnson, a massive man from Texas who had competed in the previous Olympics. Harold took an immediate liking to the talkative young boxer, even though he didn't think Clay had much chance of meddling. One night, 3 days before Clay's first fight, Harold found the young boxer sitting alone on his bed, staring at his hands with an expression Harold had never seen before. "You nervous, kid?" Harold asked, settling his large frame onto his own bed. Clay looked up, and for the first time since arriving in Rome, his confidence seemed to waver. "Harold, can I tell you something honest? I'm terrified. I've never fought anyone like these European champions. They've got experience. I don't have training facilities. I've never seen coaches who've been doing this since before I was born." Harold studied the young boxer carefully. "So why are you here? Why not just go through the motions, get some experience, come back stronger in 4 years?" Clay's expression changed, that familiar fire returning to his eyes. "Because I didn't come here to learn. I came here to win. I came here to show the world that Cassius Clay is the greatest fighter who ever lived, even if nobody believes it yet." Harold laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation for the kid's audacity. "Well, then I guess you better go prove it." The first preliminary fight came faster than Clay expected. His opponent was Yvonne Bose from Belgium, a solid fighter with a traditional European style. In the American corner, Coach Bennett gave Clay simple instructions. "Stay defensive. Don't take unnecessary risks. Try to go the distance without getting hurt. This is about gaining experience." But when the bell rang, Clay did something that shocked everyone in the arena. He came out dancing, moving with a speed and fluidity that seemed impossible for a light heavyweight. His hands were down by his waist instead of protecting his face, violating every fundamental rule of boxing defense. He leaned backward to avoid punches instead of blocking them, moving his head with such precision that because his fists whistled through empty air again and again, the crowd, initially indifferent to this preliminary bout, began to take notice. Who was this kid who moved like a dancer and punched like lightning? Because frustrated by his inability to land clean shots, began to tire from swinging at air. Clay, meanwhile, picked his moments carefully, landing quick combinations that scored points without wasting energy. When the decision came, it was unanimous in Clay's favor. But more importantly, people were starting to talk about the American kid with the unorthodox style. Coach Bennett's reaction was mixed. They'd won, which was good. But Clay's style violated everything Bennett believed about proper boxing. "You got lucky," Bennett told Clay after the fight. "Against better competition, leaving your hands down like that will get you knocked out cold." Clay just smiled. "Coach, I wasn't lucky. I was fast. There's a difference." The second fight came 3 days later against Gennady Shatko from the Soviet Union, a much tougher opponent with genuine international experience. The Cold War tensions of 1960 meant that any American versus Soviet matchup carried extra weight, and suddenly Clay's fight mattered beyond just boxing. American officials emphasized to Bennett that losing to the Soviets would be embarrassing for the country. The pressure was on. Bennett pulled Clay aside before the fight. "Listen to me carefully. This Soviet fighter is the real deal. He's tough, he's experienced, and he's been training specifically to beat American boxers. You need to fight smart, protect yourself, and try not to get knocked out." Clay listened respectfully, nodded at all the right moments, and then proceeded to completely ignore every piece of advice Bennett gave him. When the bell rang, Clay came out even faster than before. His footwork so quick that Shatko seemed to be fighting a ghost. Every time the Soviet fighter set his feet to throw a power punch, Clay was already gone, circling to a new angle, landing quick jabs that accumulated points round after round. By the third round, something remarkable was happening in the arena. The crowd, initially neutral, was starting to cheer for the American kid who moved like no boxer they'd seen before. Shadow was a skilled fighter, but he looked confused, frustrated, unable to implement any of his training against an opponent who refused to fight like a conventional boxer. When the final bell rang and Clay's hand was raised in victory, the cheers were genuinely enthusiastic. But the real test was still coming. Clay's semifinal opponent was Bigiev Petrus from Poland. And this wasn't just another tough fighter. This was a legend. Petrus was a three-time European champion, a bronze medalist from the previous Olympics. And at 27 years old, he had more international experience than the entire American boxing team combined. He was favored not just to beat Clay, but to win the gold medal for Poland. When the matchup was announced, American officials were openly pessimistic. Bennett told reporters that Clay had done well to make it this far, but Petrus was simply too experienced, too skilled, too polished for an 18-year-old to handle. The betting odds in Rome heavily favored the Polish champion, and even Clay's teammates assumed this was where his Olympic journey would end. The night before the semifinal, Clay couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed in the Olympic Village, listening to Harold's steady breathing from across the room, and thought about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about the basement gym in Louisville, where he'd learned to box, about the amateur tournaments where he dominated local competition, about the coaches and fighters who had dismissed him as too young, too flashy, too unconventional. He thought about his family back home, watching on television if they could afford it, believing in him even when nobody else did. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Clay got out of bed and went to the bathroom mirror. He looked at his reflection at the lean, young face that still showed traces of teenage uncertainty, and he spoke to himself in a whisper that would become his trademark in years to come. "You're the greatest," he said quietly. "You're the fastest, the smartest, the most beautiful fighter in the world. And tomorrow you're going to prove it." The day of the semifinal fight arrived with perfect Italian weather, sunny and warm with a light breeze that did nothing to calm Clay's nerves. The arena was packed with thousands of spectators who had come specifically to watch the legendary Petrus advance to the finals. Clay was just the obstacle, the young American who would provide some entertainment before the real star moved forward. In the locker room before the fight, Clay wrapped his hands with unusual care, his movements slower and more deliberate than usual. Bennett watched him, surprised by the kid's sudden seriousness. "You know this Petrus is the best you've faced, right? Nobody's expecting you to win. Just go out there, do your best, and hold your head high regardless of what happens." Clay looked up at his coach, and Bennett saw something in the young fighter's eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear or doubt. It was absolute, unshakable confidence mixed with a hunger that Bennett had seen in very few fighters over his long career. "Coach," Clay said quietly, "I didn't come to Rome to do my best. I came to win gold. And that man standing between me and the finals, he's about to find out what speed really means." When Clay walked out to the ring, the crowd's reaction was polite but unenthusiastic. When Petrus entered, the arena erupted in cheers. The Polish champion looked every inch the seasoned professional, his expression calm and confident, his movements economical and precise. Next to him, Clay looked like a kid who had wandered into the wrong arena. The bell rang for round one, and what happened next would be talked about in boxing circles for decades. Clay came out faster than he'd moved in any previous fight, his feet barely touching the canvas as he circled the ring. Petrus, experienced and patient, stalked forward with textbook footwork, cutting off the ring like champions do. He threw his first combination of perfectly executed jab cross-hook sequence that should have caught Clay clean. But Clay wasn't there. He'd leaned back at an impossible angle, the punches missing by inches, and before Petrus could reset, Clay had landed 3 lightning-fast jabs to the champion's face and danced away. The crowd gasped. That wasn't supposed to happen. Champions didn't miss against teenage amateurs, but it kept happening round after round. Peter Zakowski was a brilliant boxer, but he'd never faced anything like this. Every strategy he tried, every combination he threw, every defensive adjustment he made, Clay seemed to anticipate and counter. In the second round, the Polish champion landed a solid right hand that would have staggered most fighters. But Clay just shook his head slightly and smiled as if to say, "Is that all you've got?" By the third round, something extraordinary was happening in the arena. The crowd, which had come to cheer for Petrus was starting to cheer for both fighters. Clay's movement was so beautiful, so unprecedented that even partisan fans couldn't help but appreciate what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a boxing match. This was the birth of a completely new style. Coach Bennett stood in the American corner, watching in disbelief as everything he'd taught about boxing fundamentals was being violated, and yet somehow working perfectly. The kid's hands were still down by his waist. His head movement was still his primary defense, and he was still landing punches from angles that shouldn't be possible. And it was working against one of the best fighters in the world. The final round was pure drama. Petrovsky, knowing he was behind on points, came forward with everything he had, throwing combinations with the desperation of a champion who could feel his gold medal slipping away. Clay, exhausted but determined, dug deep and found reserves of speed and courage that surprised even himself. He traded punches with the Polish legend, matching him blow for blow, refusing to simply survive and instead choosing to dominate. When the final bell rang, both fighters were exhausted, but Clay's hand was raised in victory. The arena exploded in applause, not just for the American winner, but for both fighters who had given everything they had. Peter Zakowski, gracious in defeat, hugged Clay and whispered something that would stay with the young fighter forever. "You're going to be world champion someday. I've never seen anyone move like you." The gold medal match came 2 days later against Ziggy Peter Zakowski's Polish teammate. No, wait, that's wrong. The final was against Italy's Franco de Pisoli, fighting in front of his home crowd in Rome. But after beating Peter Zakowski, Clay knew he could beat anyone. The final was almost anticlimactic. Clay boxed brilliantly, controlled every round, and when the decision was announced, Cassius Clay was the Olympic gold medalist. Standing on that podium with the gold medal around his neck, listening to the American national anthem play in a packed Italian arena, Clay felt something profound. He wasn't just a kid from Louisville anymore. He wasn't just the fighter people had underestimated. He was an Olympic champion, and the whole world had watched him do what everyone said was impossible. That night, Clay didn't sleep. He wore his gold medal constantly, even in bed, feeling its weight against his chest and knowing it represented something bigger than boxing. It represented every person who had ever been told they were too young, too unconventional, too different to succeed. It represented the power of believing in yourself when nobody else does. When Clay returned to America, he wore that medal everywhere. On the plane, through the airport, walking down the streets of his hometown. But what happened when he got home? The discrimination he faced despite being an Olympic hero. That's a story that would shape the rest of his life and eventually lead him to change his name to Muhammad Ali and become not just a boxing champion, but a champion for justice and human dignity. The kid who was underestimated in Rome had proven everyone wrong. He'd floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee before anyone even knew those words would become his trademark. He'd shown that greatness comes not from following the rules, but from having the courage to create your own path. And standing on that Olympic podium at 18 years old, Cassius Clay had taken his first giant step toward becoming the greatest of all.